I feel like when I was first able to learn something like that, that felt so amazing because it almost like made you feel more powerful. You have now understood a concept that you will never forget. You never had to study notes for it. You never have to write it down. Compared to that, your friends are cramming this crap before exams all the time. They're wasting hours and pages of their notes, and you don't even have to try. Like, doesn't that feel good? That feels so good that like you can do something that other people would have to struggle so hard to do. Hi everyone, welcome back to Atlas Uncharted, the podcast where we talk about all things related to science and education.
Welcome.
So, as you can see, Wayne, it seems like we've been transported into a completely different room.
Yeah, this week we're in the consult room, right? A little bit about it. We'll talk more about this in future episodes when we're talking about supporting student well-being and other things like that. But this consult room is pretty special to us because, as you can see, we've even painted it purple. The first of our many decorative exploits.
Probably the nicest room in our office right now.
Yeah, I agree. We've got like a carpet lit below on the ground as well that you might not be able to see. Every single new student who joins us has to talk to one of us first here so that we can see where they're at, how they're going, and how we can help them. And also sort of just start establishing learning goals from them right from the get-go. As well as all of our existing students, every single term they'll have at least one mentor session with us where they talk to us and we can see how they're going, get sort of more individualized feedback and a chance to talk both about their content learning, but also about their skills and learning their learning journey in general, right?
Yeah, hopefully I find like this can be like a nice small room where like when you close the door, it's kind of like you're shut off from the outside world.
Exactly.
And like you can really start to like think about and talk about some really important things about the future.
Yeah, and that's why we, and along with our lovely associate Jeff, have put so much sort of thought into trying to make this as nice as possible while still on our limited budget.
Yes, and hopefully we can continue to make the rest of the office look this nice. But yeah. Let's get into things, right? So today we're just going to be continuing what we started the last time we had sort of chat, where we're going to be talking about sort of what works best, the report published by the Centre of Education, Statistics and Evaluation,
CZ, from the New South Wales Department of Education, yes.
Yeah. So to move on straight from that first part or first episode, we'll be talking about themes number 3 and 4.
Exactly.
Right?
And what are those themes, Anto?
So theme number 3 is effective feedback. Probably can't see it on the wall, it's a bit too far away, but it's the green poster right there. And the 4th theme is using data in practice.
Yeah, which is basically how teachers use feedback. So it's basically both just about feedback, one about feedback for students, one about feedback for teachers.
Yeah. So to get right into things, let's talk about the 3rd theme, right? So everyone, I think, agrees unanimously that feedback is an important thing in learning. But we want to unpack this. We want to think about this a little bit more deeply and question and ask, what does feedback actually look like? And what are the best forms of feedback? I think a good way to sort of demonstrate how we can do feedback better or good examples of feedback is to sort of just describe a typical classroom or how feedback is normally given at a traditional high school. Not to throw any school under the bus, right? But it's sort of the stereotypical approach that we normally see done in high schools, and contrast that with how we would like to do things differently in terms of how we teach.
And what does it normally look like?
Yeah, so we'll try and paint a picture, right? So imagine you're a student. You sit an exam, right? Say your term week exam, right? You hand it in. A few weeks later, your exam gets returned to you. So what do you see explicitly? So you'll get your literal paper back. You'll get ticks and crosses and numbers, such as a mark. And you'll probably get some papers that constitute solutions. They'll have things like marking criterias and sample answers.
Yep.
And if you're lucky, you'll also get some sort of talk from the teacher, normally addressed to the entire grade, sort of debriefing the whole exam.
Yeah. And you may also get like a few sort of small comments on the side of your written response. Things like being underlined and like little comments here and there being like, oh, where does this sentence lead you to? What do you mean by this? And things like that. But obviously it is limited by the fact that teachers have a lot of exams to mark, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So let's contrast that with an example. I have an example here from our Term 1, Year 12, Module 7 Physics exam that we ran. And this is just the last question. It's a 6-mark extended response question from the exam. We'll show it up onto screen, but I think we'll try sort of not go too much into the physics, but try to talk more about the feedback side. So effectively, it's just a question here. And this question relates to 2 particular concepts in physics, blackbody radiation and the photoelectric effect. And basically for each of these 2 concepts, there's sort of multiple different branches of content understanding that you need to answer, to understand the concept, right? So there's explanations from different scientific models, as well as what the actual observations were in the actual experiments. And so the question that we've shown up here is asking specifically about how these concepts relate to one of those three branches, maybe. So in this case, it's the quantum model of light. And so straight away, when we were writing this question, the goal here was to, because obviously when we're teaching, we need to teach the full picture. You need to understand all of the concepts out there, right, that relate to a particular idea. But not every single question is going to ask you about all of the ideas. So an important skill for students is to be able to pick and choose the relevant ideas from that framework in order to answer a question.
Yeah, so it's a classic mistake of students who are sort of almost at the point of understanding, but not yet, to simply regurgitate everything that's vaguely relevant to a concept.
Exactly. And we see that happen all the time. So in our feedback, so the solutions for this exam, and in fact, just when we were writing the question in the first place, the aim was to really catch students out on this particular skill. So yes, the aim of this question was to test that particular content, but also to test this particular skill as well. The first thing we want the students to see before seeing the actual sample answer, before even seeing the marking criteria for how the question is marked, the first thing we want to show them is what we call the marker's notes. So in this case, we're just going to put it up on screen. This is the marker's notes. We won't read this out, but effectively what it's saying is, it's saying, hey, this question didn't ask you about all of these different ideas from these two branches of knowledge. It asked you about these particular things and you had to link them together, but really it was talking about these two things, which means if you were talking about the full thing as a whole, then you didn't read the question properly, and you should be thinking about sort of how to analyze and break down the question in the first place. Right.
Yeah. And I think it's important to contrast this with what happens if you don't have these markers notes. Because imagine that, if we don't have these markers notes basically explaining the intention like Wayne was just saying, what do you do as a student? Right? I would suspect, or I'm pretty confident, that students who are sort of more on the, not as confident about this theory, all they would know is that I stuffed up the question. Yeah. I stuffed up the question, I didn't talk about the right things. Okay, so these were the right things to talk about. But they don't know why. So as a sign to any students listening, if you look back at the feedback you're currently getting at whatever you do, schooling, tutoring, right? And if you think the most valuable thing out of the feedback is the sample answer, then you might want to reassess the quality of feedback you are getting, to be honest.
Exactly. If you're playing tennis and you've got a tennis coach out there and you're hitting the ball and it's not top spinning in the right way and it's not landing in the court right, and then what the coach does is just hits the ball into the net and is like, this is how you do it, do that. How useful is that going to be to you? Obviously, it's not going to be. You need to actually break it down for that particular student. Individualized, effective feedback. But back on track. Next big thing is, before you get to the sample answer, you want to understand how the question is marked, and so therefore what your answer should have, right? And that's normally what the marking criteria, which will show up here, that's normally what the marking criteria is meant to show you.
I'll just make a really quick comment though. I don't think there's much value in me saying this, but I really want to get this off my chest. I read a lot of school exams, and the marking criteria are so bad. Like marking criteria, as Wayne will try and show you, and hopefully you can read off the screen, are meant to sort of break down the structure of how you would answer the question. But literally, so many marking criteria I read are literally like the question said again. Like if it's like describe how something works, the criteria is like describes clearly. It describes clearly how it works. Actually, what the hell? This is not useful.
And sometimes the difference from the top band to the second band is just a
they change the adjective. Describes vaguely.
Well,
sorry, there was no value in that. I just wanted to bitch about it.
This is the criteria that we tried to write up for the question. It's not perfect. It sort of shows you the difference between what a top band and a second band does. And it even does that thing that you just called out, that the difference is sort of comprehensively explains versus just explains. And so the reason, this is what marking criteria look like though. I've never seen a marking criteria that doesn't look like this. So as a student, if you're trying to get effective feedback for how your answer would have answered that marking criteria is not very useful. So what we've tried to do, and again, this is something that we only thought of and tried to experiment with last term, is this section on screen. It's the how we mark it section. And what it tries to do is it tries to break down what the marking criteria is for a student who doesn't really understand the marking criteria. Now, it's in by no means perfect, right? It does this sort of classic mistake where it's like, oh, 1 mark for this, 1 mark for this, 1 mark for this, which obviously isn't how things actually get marked, right? But if it was a perfect response, this is roughly where those marks would sort of be coming from. So it does sort of help a student gauge how to get better despite not being perfect. And you can see on the how we mark it that it sort of can break down exactly where those sort of ideas in the question are coming from for the student. So that's the second thing, that effective feedback. It's even with the marking criteria, it's probably not enough for the student to actually be able to look at it themselves to understand how they could improve their answer. Only then do we show our sample answer. And here it is. That's the sample answer, right? That we think the most concise way of sort of actually getting the marks for.
I think another instance of feedback that I think is really interesting to discuss is just feedback as it naturally occurs in the process of learning or in the classroom. And what I mean by that is like sort of like not marking, but literally like the responses students are given on their learning journey. And so sort of to like try and like elaborate on that a little bit more. I think it's one of those things where, one of the takeaways from the report, which I guess makes sense to most people, is that there are types of feedback that are not very effective. The report outlines some examples of feedback that wouldn't be that good.
Do you have some of these examples? I'd be quite curious.
So 2 of the ones that the report mentioned, one of them is essentially feedback that involves the innate intrinsic ability of a student. So that's like saying feedback where you're saying, oh, you're so smart. You're so wonderful. You're such smart students, right? Which I guess it's good to be nice sometimes. Maybe I should be nicer to my students.
I think I've fallen victim to that trap as well. Sometimes just telling the students, it does feel good, maybe.
Yeah. But yeah, I think it's basically the reasons why the report outlines why this sort of feedback is not as effective.
Right.
Is because like that's like stuff you can't change.
Yeah.
Right. It's like saying like, good job on being Asian. Like, I couldn't change that, right? I'm not saying anything about being Asian. I just tried to come up with a trait that's unchangeable, you know? So I feel like there's no attachment. There's nothing for the student to be proud about. Whereas they contrasted that where they're saying a better alternative is to give feedback to students based on the process or the effort they took.
Right.
So it's like, I see that you have spent time, or I see you have used this method to solve the question. You've drawn this diagram before attempting that. That was good. Fix this, right? But that's literally rewarding the students for putting in work. That's rewarding students for something they did of their own.
Right. Yeah, and it's really important that you bring that up, I reckon, because feedback isn't just about what you can do better, but it's also that learning is a holistic journey. You don't want to feel like garbage after your exam either, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the other example of like good versus not good feedback that I found really interesting, just because it felt personally relevant to me, is sort of intrinsic versus extrinsic rewards. Just to define it, intrinsic rewards are rewards that are, as they say, like personal, unchangeable, related to the individual.
Right.
So I guess if we go to the sports example, it's like if you are learning a new skill. You said tennis before, so let's do tennis. Okay. Let's say you're practicing your serve in tennis, right? And you nail it, you get it in, and you feel awesome. Yeah. You're like, I have achieved something, right? That is intrinsic feedback. You have felt something. You have been given something as intrinsic a response reward, right? To doing something, right? So it's sort of like the more pure inner reward. Whereas extrinsic was something that was caused by someone else on the outside. Whether that's like you nailed that serve and now you won a competition and you got $50, right? You know, like you got a trophy,
good example.
You got some money, right? Yeah. Stuff like that. And so in the context of learning in the classroom, the report says, once again, in a way that is probably not controversial to many people, that extrinsic rewards are not very effective. You know, things like stickers, candy, and stuff like that. Like they're nice. Surely they don't do harm, but they're definitely not as effective compared to more significant intrinsic forms of feedback.
So if I can be the devil's advocate here, though, like, probably extrinsic motivation can never be as strong as intrinsic motivation, but I'm sure there are use cases where it's quite valuable. Like you and I talk about gamification of learning all the time, which for you viewers back home, it's sort of the idea that just like how in video games you feel good and you want to keep on progressing and keep on leveling up, we can sort of harness that in education and in learning. So I think a lot of online sort of learning places, things like a Khan Academy type places, will give you XP and level ups and reward points for getting through new content or getting questions right. And that's definitely an extrinsic motivator.
100%,
but it certainly is effective in that use case, right?
Yeah, you're right. And I was trying to think about this, try to understand the sort of interplay between intrinsic and extrinsic rewards. Because that's really the secret, right? How do you use both in the right synergy? And I believe, I read this a very long time ago, and it sounds right to me now, but I don't remember if I remember it correctly. But it seems like the trick with extrinsic and intrinsic rewards is if a person is doing something already for intrinsic reward, if they're already intrinsically motivated to do something, then there is a harm that an extrinsic reward that you pile on top of that actually corrupts their intrinsic desire to do something.
Do you have like an example of that? Because I think we can really solidify that with that.
I think a really good example of that, which is might be, I'll change the context a little bit so it's not as personal. But I think what the article talked about for that was essentially paying people in the workplace, where they're saying, if you have someone in a position...
This could get quite controversial again.
Right. I think in the example, they actually discuss like a legitimate business example, where essentially people who are in this job position that they were intrinsically passionate about, they wanted to work on, they were rewarded well for it. They were already paid well for it. And so the boss thinks, you know what? These guys are great. I'm going to pay them even more money anyway. Right? And so they got paid even more money. And in fact, it was recorded that their motivation for the task actually decreased. And so the reason for that, I think, is like there's the idea of there's a threshold. Like extrinsic motivation, just like in the examples you mentioned before of like candy, points, bright colors, flashes, lights, are supplementary. They can make they can make it feel a bit sweeter, but when they overtake the intrinsic reward and they start to corrupt it, that's when they actually are no longer effective or they have an adverse effect.
Okay.
So I think the trick is extrinsic rewards, like they shouldn't have to be significant in terms of like monetary reward. Like you can imagine if we exaggerate it, it would be kind of weird if we just like, for example, if students did well in one of our exams, we can say congratulations, we can give them a sticker, we can give them some chocolate. That all sounds fine.
But giving them prize money probably isn't as good, is it?
Well, prize money might be okay if it's a normal number, but imagine if you gave them $1,000 for getting the top mark in the exam. Right? Because then if you play out this scenario to an extreme, you probably have a lot of people trying for it, but now you're like, what if they're not studying about it the right way? What if they're memorizing answers now? What if if you think about it, if you give that as a reward, they now don't care about learning physics or chemistry for the sake of learning it. They're actually only focused on the money. Yeah. And so we've actually accidentally just perfectly derived the scenario that article was just talking about.
And extrinsic reward. Because if you take away that reward, then now they've completely lost motivation for it. Right? Like, really want students to be learning because of the love of learning, but now they just learn for the money, and without the money, they won't learn.
Yeah, I guess it's like there's like two cases here. The bad case is if extrinsic rewards are significant and you become dependent on it. The good case is if extrinsic rewards leads a novice into the learning journey, but then they're sort of slowly weaned off of it. So that it
really is a drug, isn't it?
Right? So then you can then do it properly. It's the same thing, like any sort of skill, right? When you learn a sport, at the start, you need help. You need your coach to encourage you. You need to go to classes. But when you get to like a really good level, you want to train yourself already. You fall into that habit of working out, building on skills, getting your own feedback. But yeah, and like I guess just to bring this back to the classroom environment.
Yeah, because that was a huge tangent.
Where I feel really strongly about this is like I have a really like purist approach to learning chemistry, which I know is not appropriate for every student, but I like to push it and I'll try and adapt to every student. But I always try and start from a purist approach, where I think for me in my learning journey, by far the best feeling, the strongest thing that sort of kept me in the game, kept me working hard, was that intrinsic feeling of just achievement. Like when I could learn a concept, one of the cool things I always like to talk about in chemistry is the idea that if you know the fundamentals, you can derive anything, which is true for any science. But
it's probably just not as hard to do in chemistry as potentially some other fields, right?
Yeah. So what are some obvious examples? I think a year 11 example that I like a lot is periodic trends. I like to rant about that a lot. Yes. Because
it's
just
all
for
electronegative.
Exactly, right? Just to like give context.
Yeah.
So in the year 11 module 1 syllabus, so I'll try and say it in a way that everyone can understand even if they're not doing chemistry. There's this concept, these things called periodic trends that are like things like atomic radius, electronegativity. They're essentially properties of atoms. And they have certain patterns in how they change over time. Or not over time, but compared to different elements.
Through the periodic table, right?
Yeah, so they are periodic, right? And so the way schools traditionally teach this, which I hugely disagree with, is essentially here are 6 trends, memorize them, memorize the pattern. And it sucks. And like if you learn it like that, it's like pages and pages of rubbish that you have to memorize. But what I really like is how every trend you can sort of derive from common sense. Where it's like, what happens if you take a step to the right on the periodic table? Oh, your element has one extra electron, one extra proton. How does that change things? Your electron might result in extra repulsion effects between electrons, right? Your extra proton might strengthen the nucleus pull on electrons, bringing them together. So there's all these factors at play, but they're all just simple, like positive, negative electrostatic effects, things you can imagine, things that are obvious. And when you think along those lines, you can actually use those basic steps to derive the patterns.
Exactly.
And then, like, I feel like when I was first able to learn something like that, that felt so amazing because it almost like made you feel more powerful. It was like, here's what I can do with my knowledge now.
Yeah, and you can derive new trends now, like that now, right?
Exactly, right? Yeah. So all the trends are locked together. So you feel more powerful on literally like an academic level because you're able to solve problems you couldn't solve before. But the other thing is you feel more powerful, I guess, on an intellectual level in the sense that like you have now understood a concept that you will never forget. If you really understand it, you'll never forget it. You never had to study notes for it. You never have to write it down. Compared to that, your friends are cramming this crap before exams all the time. They're wasting hours and pages of their notes, and you don't even have to try. Like, maybe I sound a bit evil now, but like, doesn't that feel good? That feels so good that like you can do something that other people would have to struggle so hard to do, right? Let's move on to our next theme. Let's talk about theme number 4, using data to inform practice.
Right, so basically how teachers use feedback and data to improve their teaching.
Yeah, so I really I'm liking the fact that we're talking about both of these themes together because really they're just like two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, and I'm sure that people who wrote the article were thinking that too.
Yeah, so when you get assessment results from students, the information that comes back to the student constitutes feedback for them. Theme number 3, and the information that comes back to teachers to help them work out how to change their teaching is theme number 4, how to use data to inform practice.
Precisely.
If I say something like, we need to obtain more data to hold teachers accountable, then everyone suddenly gets scared. Everyone suddenly gets this instinctive pullback reaction because, if you know about the wider world of one of the issues in education, one of them is sort of the stress that a lot of teachers are put under if they're forced to meet a certain threshold, and that threshold is unreasonable, right? Things like whether they're, in some places where their pay is dependent on the results of their teachers, their chances of promotion, right? They are reprimanded if their students don't achieve a certain mark average or something.
Is that a thing?
I know it's a lot bigger in America.
Wow.
Like that's more of a system. Like in America, they have like literal like evaluation metrics for, okay, you failed, you're under this number now.
Right. I mean, in theory, that sounds like it would be useful, but it sounds like in practice, it would most likely be corrupted in many ways.
Yeah, so I really want to discuss this because, yes, I agree. That level of using data to just set all these goals on teachers is not productive for anyone. But here's my take on it, though, because we know, like, as people of science, as people who want data is important. It's just, it can't be misused in this application. And I think the fix is you can have thresholds. You can use them to gauge and achieve accountability amongst your teachers. But the thresholds have to be actual basic thresholds.
Right.
I think one example of that is the NAP plan, right? Because actually, I do hear some people complaining about NAP plan, but nowhere near as much as something like the HSC, right? But like, did a NAP plan ever stress you out? Not really, yeah, right? And like,
I'm sure there's some students who got stressed out by NAP plan.
Did our teachers care that much about NAP plan?
Again, not really, but like, I think we are not the standard students. We're not the standard students.
Maybe, but like, I understand the purpose of the NAP plan. Like, the NAP plan is what standardized testing is meant to be, which is to get information about students in a systemized, standardized way across, a very large sample size. And
but there is also the stress where, like, because if it's just about getting the information, then fair enough. But like, for example, didn't a few years ago they introduced that your NAP plan result, became a HSC requirement. Like, that seems like it could be quite a stressful thing for both students and teachers.
Yeah, I do feel like that was very politicized. I didn't look into it very carefully back then, but it seems like the thresholds to being eligible for the HSC because of your NAP plan mark was like very basic. It did feel like the people who would have been excluded from that would have been like a very small minority who the government at least might have had a point in arguing maybe they shouldn't have actually bothered sitting the HSC.
But yeah, fair enough. Like, NAP plan in general as just an information gatherer, a data gatherer, that does sound very good, yeah?
Yeah. And I think it's like...
Not perfect, but...
if that's the case, it's always like, I always have this discussion with a lot of people where everyone agrees, like, these sorts of examinations are not good for just evaluating the ability of your students. Like, it shouldn't be something like the HSC where it decides your future. But we still need it, right? Yeah. And I think, once again, the fix is that these sorts of standardized testing are used to test threshold competencies, right? If that's all, if it's just data gathering and it's not something that determines the fate of everything, then I think that's a perfect way to actually hold teachers accountable, because now if students are failing that...
By threshold, you just mean it's sort of the bare minimum that you'd expect everyone to be able to achieve in the first place anyway.
Yeah, and if someone is failing that, then it might not even be the teacher's fault, but at least we know that's a legitimate concern now if someone who fails that threshold. Whether it's the student who needs extra attention, whether it's the whole school itself, whatever, there is definitely a problem at play that needs to be addressed. And we don't care whose fault it is, but we can at least intervene and fix it.
Even on the small scale, like, I think it definitely, everyone can agree with the idea that on the small scale, just between a teacher and their student, the data that forms the feedback for the teacher from the student is definitely important, right? So for example, when the teacher marks their own students' homework, they get immediate feedback about what content they understood, what content they didn't understand, what skills do they still need to develop regarding the particular concepts, or potentially answering questions. And so straight from that, the teacher can then go on to use that to guide their teaching.
And I guess one thing we always debate about regarding that is, like, how do we do this in a practical way? Because obviously it's so hard to, like, type up all this data and to gather it.
Practical, scalable. So we're always thinking about, aren't we?
Yeah, so we're hoping the answer is just if you make a good enough system. I think it's two things. Like, the first primary answer is you need a system to back up the teachers. You cannot have each teacher do this by hand. That's impossible. And then the second close answer to that is we also need to upskill the teachers a little bit regarding how to use data to inform practice. I thought it was really interesting, I guess, because I think knowing more about this, I think anything where it's like being a bit more of an expert in a specific area, it's something a lot of us think about in our everyday lives. We wish we were better at something, but we never have the time to go about and do it. And I think that's actually really reflective here, because one interesting study that this report highlighted was that across a few different studies that sort of asked schools and teachers what they wanted more improvement on, in two separate studies, one that involved New South Wales schools, the sort of biggest area of weakness that was highlighted on a school level was how inefficiently data from students was used to inform how to be better. Right. So schools
what were some of the claims? Yeah.
I don't know. They just said that, honestly. It was like, this is the key area out of all of them. But yeah, they gave this idea of, like, inefficiencies. Like, I guess another thing they elaborate about is how we already have so much data taken from high school students, from their exams, from the surveys they fill in, but then used very inefficiently or not at all.
Yeah, it's the whole idea that data itself doesn't mean anything. You need data to gain information, which means actually pulling the trends or pulling particular things from there. And then from that information, you can actually get the insight that can then guide practice, right?
Yeah, and I think that actually brings up something really interesting. I'll try and bring it up on my screen. One of the specific studies that was mentioned within the report that I thought was quite interesting, and I sort of dug back into to try and find the original article on. And it's about sort of how to actually sort of train teachers. Like, what do teachers need to be upskilled on to use data correctly to work out how to teach better? And so the results I want to talk about are a really interesting list of concepts which make so much sense when I was sort of just having a read about them. Yeah, so essentially, a number of conditions required for the use of assessment data to have an impact. Some of these include the data needs to provide teachers with curriculum-relevant information.
Right.
That's already really important off the bat. And
what does that mean? What does that mean?
Essentially, it means the results that like the feedback of the data you get has to directly relate to what the syllabus says. So it can't just be like, students are not confident about maths. Like, it has to be like, this is the dot point they are weak in, right? These are the areas of weakness. And I guess, once again, just like our conventional school example for feedback, I feel like, it'd be really fun for us to try and insert where we've tried to do that in our own feedback practice.
For us at Atlas, feedback is one of the core 5 pillars that we have. And maybe one day we'll have a chance to talk about the 5 pillars, which are just sort of the big key things that we think we want to work on to make what we think education can be to be better. And yeah, with feedback, really, we talk about what we've done so far. This is just on the small scale, right? What we really want to be able to do is to make it scalable, practical, and also more useful, more effective. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the best way to do this is to use technology, but use it well. And yeah, like you said, one of the key things that we can do there is actually linking every single question to a syllabus dot point, so that the student, when they get the feedback from the question, they know what syllabus dot point that they are weak on. The teacher can look at a breakdown by all the different dot points for all of their students automatically to work out where their students are strong or weak. The students, when they get feedback, because it's all digitized, they can get it immediately, right? Rather than needing to wait 2 weeks for the whole homework cycle or exam marking cycle to occur. And that feedback can be specifically tailored so that for example, with a good multiple choice question, every single wrong answer should give you just as much information about the student's understanding as the right answer, right? If they pick a wrong answer, potentially they used an equation in the wrong way. They forgot to make a unit conversion in physics. Those are just my physics examples, right? And these are all things that technology can enable us to do that sort of just, like you said before, teachers can't do by hand just because it's a lot of freaking data to work with, right?
Yeah.
Like it'll take an hour for you to break down 120 students marks for particular questions, for particular dot points, for particular topics. And it's just not something that I would expect ever for school teachers to do.
Yeah. And I guess just to bring this idea to like a sort of bigger picture concept, in general, I think this is one of those big reasons why we decided, just to go really big for a second, why we think something like Atlas is essential to actually making any change in the education system. Because this level of systemization is impossible to do by a teacher. Like, unless that teacher was super dedicated, for some reason they didn't have the usual workload that they normally have at school, right? And they have all the prior skills.
And they're happy to work for free.
Yeah. Like,
which, to be fair, some teachers are.
Yeah, this would never happen. This is impossible to do within the system, right? Because, like, think about it, like what we've been describing, like an online, a digital system that's a lot smarter and a lot more personalized, right? The closest example we've seen to that is probably the software that textbook publishers sell. Things like Mastering Physics.
Yeah, those are the sorts of things that maybe we've had some experience with in uni, right? Where, because unis have good systems, they just don't have the strong student-teacher connection. And if we can sort of harness that in high schools, wow, that would be amazing.
Yeah. And the point is, all those systems were not built by just teachers for fun on the side. Unfortunately, they were built by dedicated teams of people with a honestly commercial interest in creating that software. And we're hoping Atlas can be something in the middle of that. You know, we don't want to just do things for commercial gain, but we need that flexibility and that focus that I don't think we can get if we just decide to become high school teachers and just be really passionate every day.
Yeah, and that's not to devalue any sort of passionate teacher work or anything out there. Like, that's highly valuable. It's just, you need money.
Yeah, you need money, flexibility, and not stupid administrative jobs that waste your time.
Well, yeah, I'm sure teachers will tell you all about the paperwork that they have to do nonstop.
Yeah. So yeah, like even already, right? Like that feels right.
That was your first point, wasn't it?
Yeah. What else is useful for like good feedback or good data? I really like the next point as well, which is the feedback or the information needs to be interpreted as something that informs teachers about the learning, the basic students' learning, rather than a means of separating students.
Right.
Right. So I guess it's almost like, it's kind of like a cultural thing, actually. It's sort of like an implementation or execution rather than the literal numbers itself, where it's like, if you present the numbers in a way where a teacher looks at it and goes, okay, you're obviously just trying to separate kids, then I think they can tell it's a very hollow thing and they don't feel motivated to use that data effectively. Whereas if your feedback, if your information is given in a way that's so much more meaningful, then I think the teacher can sort of read the culture from reading that and sort of like go along with that. Sorry, that sounds weird, but I'll try and back up with an example.
Yeah, because I'd expect you have a really good example about the way you write homework questions.
I was thinking about another example, which I'll stick with.
Okay.
So one of the research things I did still at uni, but one of the things I worked on last year at uni, which was a really fun research project I really enjoyed, was looking at this thing called a creative exercise.
Yes.
And just to really hone down on like the points I want to make, essentially it was like a new creative question type to like test with students and to assess their understanding. It's meant to be better than just normal multiple choice and calculation questions. The caveat is that it's harder to mark. as you would guess, a more creative question has more open ends to it. The teacher requires to spend more time and consider more things to mark a question properly. There's no like tick crossing. What was really interesting, I guess, were two things. One thing on a personal level for me, when I was interpreting it, it felt so rewarding just to read through the student answers. So basically, part of my job in the doing the project was I was meant to mark the answers students gave to these exercises when we tested them at uni. So I was basically trying to work out what information you can gather from students' responses. And they were so interesting. And one concept I really like to bring up is the concept of a student artifact.
What's that?
And it's a term sort of in the, education sphere. Basically, it sort of denotes a piece of work created by a student. Right, so it's a thing. It's a thing, basically, right? And what was really interesting is that it really opened my eyes up to, as you said in the past, how much feedback or information about the student you can gather from even the smallest things if you go beyond just the old mindset of wrong or incorrect, right? Because, a student would hand in a sheet and it would be like a mind map of all these different concepts connected together. And so, yes, I can also tick and cross all the concepts that are correct or wrong, but I can also see, this person connected this concept to this one. Oh, but they forgot to bring up this other one. Do they not know it, or do they not think it's relevant, right? Or this student brought up a concept from one field many times. Do they think that's more important than the other fields? And so suddenly it was like I was sort of getting literally like a mind map of how they constructed all their knowledge and understanding as a whole in just one picture on the page, right? And that's so much richer in terms of the data, rather than just correct and incorrect. And I think that's a real example of when I see this, I feel like this is data that will tell me about students' learning. This feels like the right data. This isn't like some cold data that I think can be manipulated to separate students into areas, And the interesting thing is I felt that, and people, so obviously creative exercises had been existed for a while, and so we sort of tested it at UCID, but, obviously as research goes, you have to read the papers of people who'd done the same exercise in the past at other unis. And it was really interesting because they actually wrote about a similar thing where, amidst all of this statistics and analysis, there's this small section and it describes, it's sort of a rebuttal where they're saying, yes, these exercises might be very tedious. It might take a long time to mark. It was on average, you might only be able to mark 5 or 6 questions every hour. It's very slow, right? But on anecdotal interviews with the academics, the lecturers who tested this at uni, they said they were happy to do that. That the lecturers actually reported when they tested it at school that they were like, now my exams take longer to mark, but I'm happy to put in this work. And I think that also reflects that. They could feel that this was the right data. They were like, I'm willing to put in effort to
That's
really back this. So it sounds weird, but I think there's a way we can present data that feels, I guess, right, feels like wholesome, rather than feels like cold and simply analytical.
Yeah, and just I think the most clear point that you've given there that I strongly agree with is just you're getting a much clearer profile about a student's understanding. And so therefore you can get much better individualized feedback and a better one-to-one relationship between student and teacher that doesn't necessarily just require straight up one-to-one conversation.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's good stuff.
Rory, what do you say? Shall we wrap that up?
Yeah. Sounds good.
Yeah. Hopefully you guys all enjoyed our chat today. And hopefully also enjoyed the chance of seeing just a little bit about what we're trying to do. And again, what we're trying to do is definitely just the start of what's going on. And even we're still doing lots of reading about how can we get better, how other people are doing things, how they can get better too. But yeah, glad you've joined us on this journey on Atlas Uncharted to just learn more. Hopefully you enjoyed it.
Hi guys.
Bye bye.